On the night of September the 22nd, 1999, a bomb squad in a Russian city called Ryazan opened 3 sacks found in the basement of an apartment building. They ran a field test. The result came back positive for hexogen, military-grade explosive, the same substance that had just killed over 300 people across Russia in the past 2 weeks. The men who planted those sacks were not hiding. When police caught them, they showed identification cards. FSB, Russia's own intelligence agency. By the next morning, the FSB director was on national television telling Russia the sacks contained sugar. One fact, one overnight reversal, and 4 people who refused to accept that explanation were all dead within 7 years. This is not the version Russia told the world, but it is the version that explains everything about how one unknown man went from nobody to president in 6 months. And by the time this ends, you will understand why that question has never been allowed a real answer. This is not a story about terrorism. Terrorism wants to be known. It announces itself. Nobody claimed the 1999 bombings. The attribution came later, from the government, not from any attacker. What this story is actually about is something colder. It is about what happens when fear becomes a tool, and who picks it up first. To understand how Putin became president, you have to understand what Russia was in 1999. The Soviet Union had fallen apart 8 years earlier, and the country it left behind was bleeding. The economy had collapsed. The ruble had crashed. Ordinary Russians lost their savings in a single week. Soldiers went months without pay. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Boris Yeltsin was the president, but he was barely governing. He was sick, he was afraid. Not of the public, but of the courts. He had made too many deals in too many dark rooms during his years in power, and if he left office without protection, some of those deals were going to find him. He had gone through 4 prime ministers in less than a year, all of them unable to hold the country together. In August of 1999, he chose a 5th, a former KGB officer, quiet, controlled, unknown to almost everyone outside the Kremlin, a man named Vladimir Putin. Political analysts gave him a few months before Yeltsin replaced him too. His approval rating sat at 31%. What happened next is why you are watching this video. September the 4th. A building in Buyansk collapsed in the middle of the night. 64 people dead, most of them military families. Asleep. Russia assumed it was connected to the long instability in Chechnya. Terrible, people said. But not surprising. 5 days later, September the 9th, an explosion on Guryanova Street in Moscow brought down an entire apartment block. 94 people dead. 4 days after that, September the 13th, another building on Kashirskoye Highway. 118 people dead in the rubble. 12 days, 3 cities, 307 people buried. Mothers began keeping their children dressed through the night in case they needed to run. Residents organized watches in their own basements, checking for anything that did not belong. Russia had stopped sleeping. And into that silence, Vladimir Putin walked. He did not sound like a politician choosing his words carefully. He was direct. He was cold. He told a terrified country he would pursue the terrorists wherever they were hiding. Russia had been waiting for someone who did not look afraid. His approval rating went from 31 to 45 to 62 to 78 in weeks. A Chechen war was launched. Bombers flew. Troops moved. The cameras followed everything. But here is what nobody was watching. On September the 22nd, in a city 4 hours from Moscow, something happened that should have stopped all of it. A man named Alexei Kartofelnikov looked out of his window late at night and saw 3 strangers dragging heavy sacks into the basement of his building on Novoselov Street. He noticed the number plate on their van had been deliberately obscured. He called the police. Officers arrived and found 3 sacks, each weighing 60 kilograms, connected to a timer set for 5:30 in the morning. The bomb squad ran a field test. Hexogen. The Ryazan FSB opened a criminal case. Terrorist attack. Suspect sketches were broadcast on national television that night. The city went on high alert. 2 men matching the descriptions were detained. They showed FSB identification. Moscow FSB called and ordered their immediate release. No charges, no names. They walked out. The next morning, FSB Director Nikolai Patrushev appeared on television. "Training exercise," he said, "a test of public vigilance. The sacks had sugar in them." The local FSB spokesman said he had heard nothing about any training exercise until Patrushev announced it on the news. The bomb squad expert who ran the test said the substance was not sugar. The Ryazan FSB director, who had personally confirmed hexogen to the press the previous night, never spoke about it publicly again. Within 48 hours, the FSB began announcing training exercises in other Russian cities, drills that had not existed before Ryazan, drills that appeared specifically to make Ryazan look routine. You do not build an alibi before anyone accuses you of anything, unless you already know what is coming. And there is still something this story has not told you yet, because the bombings themselves were only the beginning. What came after Ryazan is what made it impossible to ever look away. 4 people decided they were going to find out what actually happened in those basements. None of them finished. The first was Sergei Yushenkov, a member of the Russian parliament. He formed an independent commission. He gathered witnesses. He chased the Ryazan paper trail specifically because Ryazan was the one event that had left people with FSB badges attached to it. On the 14th of April, 2003, Sergei Yushenkov walked out of a government building where he had just registered his political party. He had been working on the commission's findings for months. He reached the door of his Moscow apartment building. He was shot 4 times. He died before the ambulance arrived. The second was Yuri Shchekochikhin, a journalist and fellow commission member. 3 months after Yushenkov was killed, Shchekochikhin fell ill without warning. His skin began to separate from his body. His hair fell out in patches. His organs started shutting down one by one. Russian authorities refused to allow an independent autopsy. A tissue sample that eventually reached a laboratory in London suggested thallium poisoning, the kind that disappears from the body within weeks and leaves almost no trace. He died without finishing what he was writing. The third was Anna Politkovskaya. She was Russia's most prominent journalist covering Chechnya, the war that began the same week as the bombings, and the questions that nobody in power wanted asked. She had been receiving threats for years and had survived a poisoning attempt on a flight to Beslan in 2004. On the 7th of October, 2006, she stepped into the elevator of her Moscow apartment building. She was shot 3 times. The 7th of October is Vladimir Putin's birthday. That fact has no official explanation attached to it. The 4th was Alexander Litvinenko. He was a former FSB officer who had watched the Ryazan incident from inside the agency and could not reconcile what he knew with what he was being told. He left Russia. He co-wrote a book called Blowing Up Russia: Terror from Within. It made a direct case that the FSB had organized the bombings to manufacture a war and produce a president. The book was banned in Russia before most people could read it. On the 1st of November, 2006, Litvinenko sat down for a meeting at a hotel in London. He drank a cup of tea. 3 weeks later, he was dying in a hospital bed, his body breaking down from polonium-210, a radioactive substance so rare it can only be produced inside a state-controlled nuclear facility. It cannot be bought. It cannot be made in a garage. Its presence in that hotel room pointed in one direction. On his deathbed, Litvinenko gave a statement on camera. He looked directly into the lens. He named Putin. A British public inquiry, completed in 2016, concluded that the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko was probably approved by Vladimir Putin and FSB director Nikolai Patrushev. The man who went on television in September of 1999 and told Russia the bomb was sugar. He was not charged. He was not arrested. He was appointed Secretary of the Russian Security Council, one of the most powerful positions in the country, where he served for nearly 2 decades. The Russian government's official investigation into the apartment bombings was closed in 2004. The verdict named 2 Chechen warlords as responsible. Both men were already dead. Neither had ever stood in a courtroom, neither had ever been cross-examined. Neither could speak, contest the finding, or name anyone else. The case was declared solved with defendants who could not answer a single question. That is not how justice works. That is how a file gets closed. On New Year's Eve of 1999, Boris Yeltsin sat in front of a camera and resigned. Before leaving office, he signed a decree granting himself and his family full immunity from criminal prosecution for life. Putin honored it without question. In March of 2000, Putin won the presidential election. The man with 31% approval in August had 53% of the country behind him by spring. The Chechen war was on television every night. The fear was still fresh. The timing was perfect. Here is what this story actually is. 307 people died in September of 1999. Their families were told it was Chechen fighters. A war was fought in their name. A president was built in their shadow. The Chechen attribution was handed down by a government that named 2 dead men and called it closed. The one incident that produced living FSB agents with badges and hexogen in sacks was reclassified as a sugar drill by morning. Every person who built a formal institutional case around that contradiction died before finishing it. There is a word for when power manufactures the emergency that justifies its own expansion. History has seen it in different countries, different languages, different centuries. The names change. The mechanics do not. Russia, in 1999, did not just produce a president. It produced a pattern. And once you see how the pattern works, you start noticing how many times it has been used before, and how many places it is still being used now. You now know something that 4 people died trying to prove. That knowledge does not disappear when this video ends. It sits with you. It changes how you read the next headline. It changes what questions you ask the next time a government points at an enemy and says, "Trust us." That is exactly what this channel is built for. Not to tell you what to think, but to show you what you were never shown. The next story is already waiting. And after what you just heard, you already know you cannot afford to miss it.